Welcome to Mountain Strong. This week our family is traveling to Fairbanks, Alaska. My wife has an art show at a cafe up there, and I'm going to be speaking at the church in Eielson, which is about 30 minutes out of Fairbanks or so. And we have therefore driven north out of Anchorage and gotten to enjoy some of the scenery along the way. We've stopped at a place called McKinley Park, and McKinley Park is named for the previous name of what is now called Denali, and so near Denali National Park. And I hope to maybe just go inside the park just a little bit to shoot the next part of this psalm that we're going to be looking at today. But it's been a beautiful drive. It's not the immediate payoff that driving south is, but definitely you come through that forest that is north of Anchorage, and you get to start seeing the mountains and get to start seeing Denali and the various mountains that make up the national park. And it is a very beautiful place to come to. And as you can see, the snow is mostly melted, not all. If you look at some of the higher mountains, you'll still see some snow, but that snow is feeding this river and making it run very fast. This morning we're going to be having a look together at Psalm 68. The next video is going to cover the second half of Psalm 68. We're just going to have a look at the first half of it today, and so we'll read verses 1 through 18 together. Let's read now. God shall arise, his enemies shall be scattered, and those who hate him shall flee before him. As smoke is driven away, so shall you drive them away. As wax melts before fire, so the wicked shall perish before God. But the righteous shall be glad. They shall exult before God. They shall be jubilant with joy. Sing to God, sing praises to his name. Lift up a song to him who rides through the deserts. His name is the Lord. Exult before him. Father of the fatherless and protector of widows is God in his holy habitation. God settles the solitary in a home. He leads out the prisoners to prosperity, but the rebellious dwell in a parched land. O God, when you went out before your people, when you marched through the wilderness. The earth quaked, the heavens poured down rain, before God, the one of Sinai, before God, the God of Israel. Rain in abundance, O God, you shed abroad. You restored your inheritance as it languished. Your flock found a dwelling in it. In your goodness, O God, you provided for the needy. The Lord gives the word. The women who announce the news are a great host. The kings of the armies, they flee, they flee. The women at home divide the spoil, though you men lie among the sheepfolds. The wings of a dove covered with silver, its pinions with shimmering gold. When the Almighty scatters there, let snow fall on Zalman. O mountain of God, mountain of Bashan, O many-peaked mountain, mountain of Bashan. Why do you look with hatred, O many-peaked mountain, at the mount that God desired for his abode, yes, where the Lord will dwell forever? The chariots of God are twice 10,000, thousands upon thousands. The Lord is among them. Sinai is now in the sanctuary. You ascended on high, leading a host of captives in your train, and receiving gifts among men, even among the rebellious, that the Lord God may dwell there. There are a number of ideas about the meaning behind this psalm, and one of the ideas that is based upon verse 17, where the picture of God there is going from Sinai to the sanctuary, is perhaps that David wrote this when he returned the Ark of the Covenant to its rightful place in the tabernacle. And of course that's altogether possible, but as I think about the overall picture of this psalm, I see God's throne as being challenged, and I see God returning from the battlefield, so to speak, having won a great victory. You see in verses 1 and 2 that there are enemies. You see in verse 18 that there are those who are rebellious. And so God's throne has been challenged, and he has come away from the challenge victorious, returning to his people, having cared for them, and having provided them with wonderful gifts. I think that really is the general picture of this psalm, even if we might not know the specific meaning. And I think that therefore there is a wonderful opportunity for us to reflect upon this psalm. You know, there's a song that we sometimes sing that says, "King of my life, I crown thee now." The song is "Lest I Forget Gethsemane." I don't know if that's the title of it. I couldn't remember, and I don't have a songbook with me. But I think about that picture, "King of my life, I crown thee now." And I think about the fact that when we say that Jesus is Jesus Christ, we're actually calling him King Jesus. Well, what is he king of? Well, he's king of the world. But as relates to me, it's important that Jesus maintains a throne upon my heart, that God is enthroned in my heart. And do you know that that throne is challenged every time I am tempted to return to sin, or every time a circumstance in life tempts me to give up on God? It happens all the time. And so what happens when God's throne is challenged? It's important to reflect upon Psalms like this, to think about how victorious our God is whenever He is challenged by enemies. And so the picture of verses 1 and 2 is that enemies have come against God, but what are they before Him? I am not a big candle man by any stretch of the imagination, but often have candles at home because of my wife, and I even like to sometimes have a candle burning in my office. I find it helps me to focus for some reason. But the candle, as it burns down, that fire goes down, that hard wax just turns into liquid in front of it. And the enemies of God, which seem solid perhaps in the minds of God's people, they melt away before God. In verse 3, he says that the righteous can be glad in their service to God. And in fact, notice the language he uses there in verse 3. The righteous shall be glad, they shall exult before God, they shall be jubilant with joy. Jubilant or jubilation is extreme joy. And so just that the highest degrees of joy are obtained by those who maintain their relationship with God, those who don't become rebellious, as the text says in verse 18, those who acknowledge Him as King. In verse 4 and from verse 4 onward, he begins to describe how God's power is manifested in various circumstances and situations to, again, not only associate God's glory with this victory, but with all the victories that He has enjoyed over the course of history. In verse 4, God is there in the desert, he says. And the language in the beginning part of this psalm seems to commemorate, obviously, what happened in the wilderness wanderings and how God carried His people through the wilderness. But I think about verse 4 in isolation, and I think about the fact that sometimes it feels like a desert. The song that comes to mind is an older song, The Desert of Sorrow and Sin. You ever sang that song before? Well, that really is how life can feel sometimes, a desert of sorrow and sin. And I thirst, the song says. Well, God always provides for those who thirst. God rides victoriously even in the deserts of life. And he goes on in verses 5 and 6 to describe the fact that God, the psalmist goes on rather in verses 5 and 6 to describe the fact that God provides a place for the weak, a home for the solitary. I love that picture. There is no one who is alone. Another song, Where No One Stands Alone, and that really is true in our service to God. No one does stand alone. But in verses 7 through 10, that most obvious image taken from Sinai in the wilderness wanderings, notice how they've been marching through the wilderness, and no doubt that was a very stressful time for them. They wondered where water was going to come from, and we know at times it came from bitter water turned sweet, at times it came from a rock. But the picture of the psalmist here is that God's people marched through the wilderness, and God made that rain to fall whenever it was needed and fall in abundance, as the picture of the psalm provides. They were God's flock. They were God's flock heading to their inheritance. God was going to take care of them. And so the psalmist pictures that. And what he's effectively picturing is the fact that God has always provided for His people. He has always cared for His people. And so why is there ever a reason for people to challenge the position of His throne? Why is there ever a reason for God's people not to be in jubilation? He describes in verses 11 through 13 this imagery of women who are announcing the victory and that are at home dividing the spoil. They haven't fought the battle. Well, have the men fought the battle either? It says actually that the men are there among the sheepfolds. I wonder maybe if this is imagery borrowed from Judges chapter 5. In Judges chapter 5, Deborah actually rebukes Reuben for having remained among the sheepfolds and not having gone out to battle like the tribe that is, should have. Well, I don't know if that's a purposeful image there, but it doesn't seem to matter that the men haven't gone out or that the women have not gone out. They're at home. What matters is that God has gone out. And because He has gone out and He alone has gone out, they are victorious and they are enjoying victory. The picture in verse 13, the wings of a dove covered with silver, its pinions with shimmering gold, is a difficult picture. Sometimes people reflect upon that and maybe they see it as a picture of God's glory. Maybe it's a picture of the spoil God provides for His people. I think about the peacefulness of a dove, and I think about it covered with silver and gold here, and I get a picture of just this beautiful picture of prosperity, perhaps, that God's people are enjoying. In verse 14, another difficult image, when the Almighty scatters kings there, let snow fall on Zalman. Zalman is the black mountain, and so there's this black mountain that has become white. Has it become white with the bodies maybe of those whom the Lord has defeated, with maybe their armaments as they're fleeing or running away? I don't really know. Is it a mountain that traditionally had snow or not? Well, people aren't even exactly sure where this mountain is, but he goes on to describe the mountains of Bashan, and Bashan, of course, is that territory on the other side of the river of Jordan, rightfully belonging to God's people. Maybe that's where the rebellion that the psalmist has in mind in this psalm is happening. I don't know. But there are these mountains away from God's land, and maybe they're jealous. They're looking at Jerusalem. They're looking at Mount Zion, which is a mountain that's not as tall as those mountains up there towards Bashan and in that area. They're looking at that and they're jealous. Why? Because that's the mountain where God is. That's where His sanctuary is. And so I don't know that I can grasp all the imagery that's contained in this psalm, but I know the overall picture of the psalm, a picture of great victory for God. The other mountains are jealous because where God dwells will always be victorious. And if He dwells in my heart, you know, the situations that I face, the things that I go through, I'm going to be victorious too. It's important to reflect upon pictures like this, because only those who maintain God's throne in their heart are those who are not counted amongst the rebellious, and those who can enjoy the gifts of God when He distributes them. In verse 18, you ascended on high, leading a host of captives in your train, receiving gifts among men, even among the rebellious, that the Lord God may dwell there. I see that in verse 18, and I'm reminded of the quotation in Ephesians chapter 4, where perhaps a little bit has changed, and maybe it's reflective of the Septuagint or something along those lines. I didn't have a chance to look at that in getting ready for this morning, but in Ephesians chapter 4, the picture there is of Jesus ascending on high and taking captivity captive, and then rather than receiving gifts from those captives, He gives those gifts to men. I think the psalmist is saying essentially the same thing even in this translation. The idea of the enemies of God being taken captive. The picture of Ephesians 4, though, all the much more powerful to reflect upon, because whatever captivates, whatever seems to enthrone or ensnare man, has no power to do so as long as the throne of God is maintained in our hearts. God will always be victorious. Captivity will always be led captive, and we will always be the beneficiaries. May God bless you today to reflect upon our victorious God and how He will work victory in your life.